An estimated 1.17 million immigrants from El Salvador reside in the United States. El Salvador, along with Guatemala and a handful of other countries, has had its natives migrate to America because of American involvement in the civil unrest in their native land. Now, in truth, there were many periods of unrest in El Salvador long before U.S. involvement. You see, in the late 1880s, coffee became a major cash crop for El Salvador. Coffee at the time had become responsible for 95% of the country's income, but unfortunately, only about 2% of the population benefited from the wealth. Sound familiar? Anyway, the income disparity led to two or three military coups over the years and then another in 1979. And just like their predecessors, the new government promised financial reform and failed to deliver. So in late 1979, a civil war broke out, and the United States of America eventually entered the conflict on the side of the government. By May 1983, U.S. officers had taken over positions in the top levels of the Salvadorian military, were making critical decisions, and were running the war. Previous periods of unrest were short-lived compared to the 12-year Civil War that ensued from late 1979 to early 1992 with American assistance. Thus, most Salvadorians who come here came fleeing violence that America had a hand in. To them, America is akin to the benefactor that takes in the homeless person that he himself had forced into homelessness. Most Hondurans, Guatemalans, and Nicaraguans that are here experience America from about the same prism as El Salvadorans. They were forced out of their countries by extremely violent conditions that were either caused by or exacerbated by America. We have close to 400,000 Nicaraguans, about 1 million Hondurans, and around 1.7 million Guatemalans living in America right now. Again, being forced from your native land, even though you end up in the richest nation in the world, has to be a bit bittersweet. Following the Spanish-American War, America received her spoils in the form of Guam and Puerto Rico, and then bought the Philippines from Spain for $20 million. But the Filipino people kept fighting for freedom, and America gave up 37 years later. And in 1939, granted Philippines their freedom. Guam and Puerto Rico, on the other hand, didn't fight for their freedom and thus remained territories of the United States. In due course, Guatemalans and Puerto Ricans were given U.S. citizenship, and as citizens they are always free to come to America, but because they are territories and not states, certain things are denied them, such as representation in Congress. They each have a representative to Congress in the House of Representatives, but they are non-voting members, just like the citizens living in the District of Columbia. Thus, no true congressional representation. And unlike citizens living in D.C., citizens of territories cannot vote in federal elections, but they do have delegates that are a part of the Electoral College vote for the presidency. Currently, the United States has 16 territories, 5 of which are permanently inhabited. The inhabited ones are, in addition to Puerto Rico and Guam, Northern Mariana Islands, the U.S. Virgin Islands, and American Samoa. All inhabitants of all territories are considered American citizens, but clearly without a number of rights afforded to citizens of the various states. Unless they come to America, the mainland, I would imagine that they experience America through identity only. Very different experience. Now, Puerto Rico is one territory that has been lobbying for statehood for some time, but without success. And it's not as if moving from territory to statehood is without precedent. I mean, both Alaska and Hawaii were territories before becoming states. As a matter of fact, during the mainland internment of Japanese peoples, there were 150,000 Japanese living in 1941 Hawaii. The only reason they weren't interned is because Hawaii was a territory at the time. Hawaii was a territory for 59 years before becoming a state, and Alaska 47. Puerto Rico, in contrast, has been a territory since 1898. 120 years. Fair or not fair? Are Puerto Ricans too close to being black? Well, after Hurricane Maria devastated the island last year, and with little federal money coming in to assist the American citizens living in Puerto Rico, many opted to move to the mainland, i.e. America. Once here, they had a great deal of difficulty obtaining health care benefits, and even though Puerto Rican Americans have a very different experience from America versus those of us inhabiting the various states. And let's also consider that, I think it was just yesterday, that Donald Trump even decided that he would deny the total number of casualties from Hurricane Maria. Ridiculous. Well, I could go on and on, but I'm just going to discuss one more group, okay? And the last group I'm going to discuss are the organizations made up of the descendants of the Confederacy. Groups like the United Daughters of the Confederacy and the Sons of Confederate Veterans are seen by most Americans as exalting traitors to America. But is that the whole picture? I know I used to think it was, but now I'm not so sure. There's always been a lot of chatter trying to depict the Civil War as a war to free the slaves. That's not true. To the extent that slavery was an issue, the two sides were in disagreement about having slaves in the new Western territory. And there was a lot of land to the west at the time. America having seized about the entire southwest quadrant of what is presently America from Mexico. Additionally, we had purchased the Louisiana Territory from France, which comprised much of what is Middle America today. The North opposed taking slaves into the new territories, not because of any moral reason. They wanted to ensure that white men would have jobs in the new territory. Both sides may have come to a compromise, but the South decided to secede from the United States and formed the Confederate States of America. Now, this country, though unrecognized, existed for 4 years, and it was at war the entire time except for the first 2 months. America officially didn't accept secession and held that it was illegal, although it wasn't explicitly made illegal until after the war. But in the lead up to secession, it truly wasn't clear whether or not secession was illegal. The southern states held that their association with the United States was voluntary, not compulsory. Now, on a micro level, one would understand that a country wouldn't want to be fragmented or split because that could dilute its capacity to defend itself as a nation. But on a micro level, it's much akin to a teenager joining a gang, deciding later he wants to sever ties, and being told that the only way out is death. When you're a jet all the way from your first cigarette to your last dying day. Had to do that. So, with the added perspective of the gang member, the question has to be asked: were Confederate members traitors or people who had joined an association and were forced to stay when they wanted to leave? Now, I must admit that prior to this particular undertaking, I had always thought of the Confederacy as nothing but traitors, but now I'm not so sure. But we can all agree that these ancestors of the Confederacy experienced America in their own unique way. The conclusion is that America, starting with the 94% who weren't allowed to participate in the formulation nor governing of the country for its first 80 years of existence, to the women who weren't allowed to participate for the first 144 years, to my ancestors who were enslaved for the first 89 years and denied participation for the first 188 years, to the hordes of citizens of other lands whose native land we either took or created or exacerbated violent conditions within and then granted refuge to them for atonement, to the inhabitants of the Confederacy who in reality sought to leave an association they thought they were in of their own free will. America has wronged, treated poorly, used, and abused the vast majority of her citizens. Clearly, you can all see this argument as unfettered truth, correct? But here's the kicker. Despite all the wrongs of America against Americans, a vast majority of us remain very patriotic. Now, why the hell is that? It's because we are all enamored with the possibility of America, the dream of America, not the reality. The American dream is what we were sold, not the American reality. The fact that Langston Hughes was a black man doesn't mean that his proclamation wasn't meant for us all. America hasn't been America to a vast majority of her citizens, but we all believe, just like Langston Hughes, in the probability that America will be. And do you know what makes Americans so hopeful? It's our right to vote, present grievances, strike, and yes, protest. That's what gives us hope, because it gives us voice, the same voice our cartoon president seeks to take away from NFL players. But it's that very voice that has enabled us to slowly force the American plutocratic oligarchy to expand from 6% participation to full participation, one demographic at a time, kicking and motherfucking screaming the whole fucking way. That's what makes America great. What makes America great is that, except for that 4-year Civil War period, our 242 years of existence has mostly featured slow, progressive change without much bloodshed, at least not as much as other countries. There's never been a need for a military coup, as we typically have had peaceful transitions in our governance. And our freedoms of speech, assembly, of and from religion, great for an atheist like me, are just things that none of us should take for granted. Even hate groups are allowed to speak and assemble as long as they do so peacefully. This is what makes our democracy great and American citizens hopeful. I truly don't know of any developed country that isn't in oligarchical plutocracy ruled by the few who are rich and the rich who are few. Because of this fact, income inequality is a problem worldwide, not just in America. Again, Mitt Romney's warning against class warfare was nothing more than a warning for the 90%ers not to fight back, not a warning against starting class warfare. The elite have waged war upon the rest of us since the inception of the country, so it couldn't have been warning against starting what has been going on for 242 years. But in America, the 4-year Civil War notwithstanding, our wars need not be physical ones. Because of our great laws and sometimes great judges, we have been able to wage successful wars in the courtrooms, and opinion pieces and articles, blogs, YouTube videos, and on the picket lines. Free speech matters. and we must not allow 40 fucking 5 to circumvent that, the way despots that he seeks to emulate do in their countries. We must heed closely the words of Frederick Douglass. Power concedes nothing without a demand. It never did, and it never will. Voting rights for non-property holding white men had to be demanded. Voting rights for women had to be demanded. The abolition of slavery had to be demanded. Voting rights for black people had to be demanded. Marriage equality had to be demanded. The prohibition against sex discrimination had to be demanded. Without the ability to peacefully protest, we could not have fashioned America into the reality of a more perfect union today versus the dream of a more perfect union in 1776. Peaceful protest matters, and we must not allow 40 fucking 5 to stop it. And whether or not you would like for anyone to stand for the national anthem or salute the flag, it is illegal for them to do so. The Supreme Court of the land established such in a 1943 case that has not been overturned. That means that it's still the law. The case was brought by Jehovah's Witnesses who were students. They argued that pledging allegiance to the United States would violate the tenets of their faith. In said case, West Virginia State Board of Education versus Barnett, the court ruled that no U.S. official, high or petty, whether politics, nationalism, religion, or other matters of opinion is the basis, could compel a person to confess by word or act their faith in or about anything. As in most cases of discrimination and compulsion, businesses are typically held to the same standard of respecting the rights of their employees that government must observe. Now, the NFL just found this out when an independent arbitrator on August 28th ruled that Colin Kaepernick's collusion suit against the NFL can go through to a full hearing where he stands to win twice the amount of compensatory damages. You see, Major League Sports typically will have to refer all grievances, claims, and potential lawsuits for arbitration instead of courts because of a collective bargaining agreement. Most times the hardest hurdle for pro athletes trying to sue the league is getting past the sole arbitrator and into full arbitration hearing. My guess is the fact that sportscasters have been opining on the regular about Kaepernick's lack of a job offer and have virtually always been expressing the sentiment that this is a guy who definitely would be playing in the NFL were it not for them blackballing him, probably made it difficult for the arbitrator to rule otherwise. Now he's about to get big bucks without actually playing. And other NFL players should take notice from free advice I'm about to give. Of course, not having been admitted to the bar in any state, all I can give is free legal advice. But Colin Kaepernick doesn't have to be the only one getting big bucks from the league without playing. But you must be careful. A second-string running back taking a knee could be fired, and the team can claim that he just wasn't good enough, and his claim of wrongful discharge might not be allowed. After all, the average playing years of an NFL running back is about, 2.5 years? But a starter, especially one of the better players, would fare differently. If one of you took a knee and was fired and couldn't get on with another team, it would be prima facie evidence of blackballing and collusion. Just think, you could make sure your finances are in order, make the protests against police murdering black folk like you want, and then get a big payday courtesy of the league without even risking any injury. In any event, it bears repeating that in America, you only have the rights that you are willing to fight for. And I am sick and tired of black folk in particular being so freaking forgiving and having come to Jesus meetings when they should be suing. Case in point, the Rutgers women's basketball team should have sued Don Imus years ago instead of the freaking come to Jesus meeting that they had. Now those of you who know me know that I'm an atheist, so I wouldn't be asking God for anything, but I'm also a former believer who has studiously examined many of the world's religions. And unlike most Christians, I've actually read the whole Bible twice. I sang in a lot of gospel choirs, attended many a church service, and was perilously close to becoming a minister. Through it all, I remember one salient caveat about waiting on God to do for you, even if you are still a believer. I recall the notion that the Lord helps them that help themselves. Preachers always tend to remind the flock that if you make one step, the Lord will make two. So if your God is the thing that keeps you from being litigious, consider that maybe filing a lawsuit when you have been aggrieved is the step that your God wants you to take before He takes the two steps of awarding you a judgment and giving you life more abundantly. The bottom line is that individual rights and freedoms are not easily circumvented. Thus, a claim of lost revenue as the reason for owners like Jerry Jones, owner of the Dallas Cowboys, to compel standing for the national anthem and prohibit the taking of a knee in silent protest just wouldn't be sufficient justification in a court of law. First of all, Jones would have to prove, not speculate, that there has been a drop in ticket sales. Then he would have to prove, not speculate, that the drop in sales is because of the silent protest of players. And finally, the loss in ticket sales would have to be substantial for the court to even consider that an exception should be made in the setting aside of the constitutional rights of American citizens. That's a tough bar to clear. And the people walking out because of the protest don't matter. First of all, you don't know if they went to the restroom. And the number of people who left wouldn't matter because there's no economic loss. The ticket price has already been paid. One would have to prove that customers aren't coming because of the protest, which is not easy to do. And how many people do you really think would forego a game that they really truly want to see just because someone does a silent protest during a 2 to 3 minute song? Vice President Pence might be the only citizen of this country who would refrain from going to a game he wanted to see under these circumstances. But he's the same guy who can't even eat lunch alone with a woman other than his wife. And the classic example of one who is so heavenly bound he's no earthly good. The conclusion. 45's call for NFL owners to get the sons of bitches out of there and fire them is illegal, and it's a shame that we have a freaking president who doesn't know that. Plus, he's only stoking the fires of division to divert attention from his Russia woes. He's going to go down, but it's imperative that we don't allow him to take the country down with him. I said earlier that once a president is elected, he becomes president of all Americans, including those of us who didn't vote for him. Now I'm going to add that we are all responsible for his election. Those who voted for him are directly responsible, and those of us who didn't are indirectly responsible because we didn't canvass hard enough to get another candidate elected, whether it was Hillary Clinton or the guy I voted for, Libertarian candidate Gary Johnson. And since we're all responsible for the mistake that is President Donald Treason Trump, it is our collective responsibility to correct our mistake by removing him. This is not the time for partisan politics because the health and welfare of our country is at stake. And whenever I use 45's actual name, I always use the middle name treason, because I firmly believe he is guilty of treason. Mostly I refer to him as 45 because I believe him to be an unconvicted criminal. Remember, according to his personal fixer, lawyer, Michael Cohen, he's an unindicted co-conspirator. And criminals are known by numbers and not names. I call him a Manchurian president because he's clearly controlled by Vladimir Putin, the leader of an enemy state. 45 tries to malign the media by calling them the enemy of the people to divert attention from the fact that he is actually public enemy number one. Now, who would have imagined we would ever be here, bamboozled into electing an actual enemy of America as president? You see, I believe him to be a Russian operative who was turned because of heavy debt. I believe the account of Eric Trump's admission that the Trumps don't rely on American banks because they have all the funding they need out of Russia. I believe that Trump defaulted on Russian bank loans just as he defaulted on loans to American banks more times than Zsa Zsa Gabor was married. I believe that since Russian banks are owned by gangster oligarchs, the squeeze was put on him. I believe that he conspired with Russia to get elected and then to deal favorably toward Russian interests as payback because bankruptcy with Russian oligarchs is simply not an option. Now, if you think that I have nothing better to do than bash 45, you're wrong. Fact is that I really need to be doing another video where I outline a new paradigm that, if followed, is guaranteed to reduce income disparity and eventually eliminate poverty. Very big boast, I know, but it's also very true. I'm not the boastful circus ringmaster that 45 is, always speaking in splendiferous terms in efforts to make myself believe my own hype. When I speak in the spectacular, it means the same as when I speak in mundane terms. And most importantly, it's still the truth either way. And it's not as if the intelligentsia is incapable of devising a similar plan or paradigm than the one that I've come up with. The fact is they simply like to do so. You see, it's a simple fact that the elite have pimped the rest of us since the country's inception. And I'm sure that you're well aware of the fact that pimps never tell hoes how to get out from under their pimp pain. Hoes gotta do that on their own. But I felt really a serious need to divert my attention to address what I call the country's anthem blues, because 45 is trying to tear apart the country that I love, and I'm not, and I don't think that we are ready to sit idly by and let that happen. We all know that it's very important that all citizens participate in the continued formation of our nation. Besides, I'm already guilty of the crime of omission by not adding to a particular discourse what I should have added during the Obama administration. When Obama sought to place Merrick Garland on the Supreme Court and Congress refused him a hearing, Obama should have displaced him on the court and let the Supreme Court decide if what he was doing was proper. They would have sided with Obama, and here's why. When courts decide the legitimacy of an action, they consider a number of things, but the main two are the plain reading of the law and the legislative, or in this case, constitutional intent. There are 3 steps to one becoming a Supreme Court justice laid out in the Constitution. The President nominates, Congress advises and either rejects or consents. Then the President either nominates another if his first pick is rejected, or appoints if his pick is consented to. So the President does 2 things. He nominates and he appoints. In between, the Congress advises and consents. The question before the court would be this: does the Constitution say, or is the constitutional intent that it be mandatory that Congress actually advises and consents, or that Congress be given an opportunity to advise and consent. I say Congress only has the right to an opportunity that they can relinquish through inactivity. Initially, constitutional scholars may balk at this assessment, but I guarantee you that eventually, after they hem and haw and talk about it, they will form a consensus that though Howard E. Barrett Jr. never practiced law, he's right on this issue. Here's the condensed argument before the court. In determining whether or not it is mandatory for Congress to actually advise and consent versus having the opportunity, we must look to the Constitution that provides the criteria. The plain language says that the President shall, and the Congress shall, then the President shall. That seems clear, but there is no provision when the President does and Congress doesn't. So legislative intent, in this case, constitutional intent, comes into play. The court would have to ask whether or not the Constitution intended there to be 3 branches of government. Upon a finding in the affirmative, the court would ask, or be led to ask by skilled attorneys, what would have happened if George Washington sought to staff the initial court, but Congress refused to have any hearings because they didn't want a 3rd branch of government? Would their stonewalling be allowed? No. And in that case, George would have simply done his part. He would have nominated, Congress would have refused to advise, and he would have appointed, leaving the judges he appointed to decide if indeed what he did was proper. Clearly, the Constitution would have been read to hold that Congress is only due the opportunity to advise and consent, and that they can relinquish said opportunity through inaction. And if that would have been the case with George, the same would apply with Obama. But I don't place the blame on Obama, nor do I dwell on the fact that he was a constitutional law professor. We are all citizens of this country, and we all must participate in its governance in every way we can. To not do so constitutes dereliction of duty, and I was derelict in my duty because I said nothing when I should have. If I had, I'm certain that Merrick Garland would be on the Supreme Court today. That was my bad. And I'll never be so silent on so important a matter again. Please let this be a lesson to you all. You have more to contribute than you may be aware of. Hopefully it is clear by now that since we don't have the totalitarian government that North Korea has, despite 45's wish that it did, it doesn't freaking matter whether or not you want athletes to stand for the national anthem because you can't compel them to do so. Hell, I just decided that I'm going to burn this flag around my neck at the end of this video. And it's not because I have any issue with the flag. I've told you that I don't, but do have issue with the anthem, and I'll explain exactly why. But I'm going to burn the flag simply to prove a freaking point. Point being, it doesn't freaking matter what you think about my burning the flag, because I have the freaking right to do so. That's the beauty of America. There is no true standard other than to not trample on another's rights while expressing your own. And though I can't trample on your rights, I can trample on your fucking feelings if I fucking choose. And guess what? So can you. Hell, even hate groups have the right to express their hate as long as they don't incite violence. I mean, it's America, baby, and that's why we all love it here.